Hey guys, in this video we're going to be looking at Chapter 2 of the Ecce Romani textbook titled A Summer Afternoon. In this chapter you're going to pick up with the story of Cornelia and Flavia, and you're going to get a better sense of what they're doing in the fields. The grammar for this chapter is going to be looking at Latin subjects and verbs, which are a critical building block for everything we're going to be doing in the rest of our time studying Latin. So again, in order to understand what's going on in this chapter, the best way is by memorizing the vocabulary. So you want to remember that always take some time to really memorize this thoroughly, as it's going to help you not only in this chapter, but moving forward. And as always, the derivatives that go with this vocabulary are going to be what connects back to your daily life in English and helps you understand these Latin words. So the first one we want to look at is amici, which is the word for friends. And in English, this leads to words like amicable, amiable, and amity, which all have to do with friendship. If you've ever studied French, Spanish, or Italian, any of these Romance languages, the word should look pretty familiar to you. And the reason for that is it's the root of the word for friend in all three languages, amico, amigo. The next word we want to look at is agris, and in our vocab it's a phrase in agris, which means in the fields. And from this we get the words agrarian, agriculture, and agronomy in English. If you don't recognize all of them, hopefully you'll notice the AGR spelling at the beginning of these words. That's the word for field. And if you can remember, agriculture is about farming and tending crops. This will help you understand what an agrarian society is, or what an agronomy is, which is an economy based on farming. From the word ambulant, which means they walk, we get the words amble, ambulance, preamble, and somnambulist, which if you break it apart, all these words have to do with walking. And if you take somnambulist, for instance, you can see that it has the root for somnus, which is sleep, and ambulare, which means to walk. So a somnambulist is a sleepwalker. If you think of a preamble, such as the preamble to the Constitution from history class, you'll notice that it has the Latin root pre in it, which means before, and amble, which is a word that has to do with walking. And what a preamble is it's an explanation of the entire document. So in other words, if you read the preamble, it's giving you all you need to understand before you start walking through the entire document. Brevi tempore is a phrase that we want to split in two. So brevi is a word that gives us derivatives such as brief and even brevity. And it also has abbreviate. And all three of these have to do with shortening your words or making something shorter. Tempore, on the other hand, is where we get temporary, temporal, and also tempo. And these words all have to do with time in English. And if you put it together, you can see the Latin phrase makes a lot of sense of in a short time, as you have those two roots. Strenua is an adjective that we get the words strenuous and strenuously from in English. And if you look at your vocab, you're going to see that strenua means active or energetic, and it means basically the same thing in English as well. If you're exercising, it really means you're exerting yourself. Currit is a Latin verb that we get in English, words like current, cursive, we also get course, and cursory. And it's a verb that means he or she runs. And if you think about it, cursive is a style of handwriting that is faster than another form, and it has to do with moving quickly. Likewise, if you give someone a cursory glance, it means that you're looking at them really quickly and then moving on. So all four of these words have that root of running or moving quickly in them. This brings us to the grammar for Chapter 2. And in this chapter, we're going to be looking at subjects, verbs, linking verbs, and complements. Hopefully some of this sounds familiar from grammar in English class, but like I said, these are the basic building blocks for understanding and building your own Latin sentences, so we really want to make sure we're studying them thoroughly here. So to start, we want to think about what we call the core elements of a Latin sentence. And the first thing we want to talk about are subjects. Subject of a sentence is the person, place, or thing that performs the action of a verb. So for instance, if I gave you the sentence, Mr. C teaches the class, you want to ask yourself, what's the subject here? And we can find it fairly easily by looking at who's performing the action. The verb here is teaching, and the person or thing doing the teaching is Mr. C. This means that Mr. C is the subject of our sentence. And what we want to do is mark that with an S so that we can recognize it. This is our subject. So the next part that we want to look at are verbs. The verb is the action word of the sentence. In other words, it's the action being performed by the subject. And you want to remember that in Latin and English, you need a verb in order to have a sentence. You can't make one without it. So it's really important that we focus in on this part of speech. So let's go back to our model sentence of Mr. C teaches the class. So again, the action being performed here is teaches, and we can see Mr. C is teaching. That's the action he's doing. This is our verb, and so we mark it with a V. So subjects we mark with an S, action words or verbs we always want to mark with a V. And again, it's because the subject, Mr. C, is teaching. This is how it all fits together. Subject, verb. So the same holds true for Latin sentences. So let's take a look at this example. Puella in Italia habitat, which means the girl lives in Italy. If we break it apart the exact same way, we can see that the subject of our sentence is Puella, the girl, and she is performing the action of living. So we want to mark Puella with an S for subject and habitat with a V. This is how we would find the subject and the verb. So just a helpful trick. Whenever you're looking at a Latin sentence, it's easiest to start by identifying your verb. Once you have the verb, you can figure out what person, place, or thing is performing the action of that verb, which will give you your subject. Sometimes, especially later on when the sentences become really complex, it's more difficult to try to find your subject first. Instead, you want to look for the verb and then go back and figure out who's performing this action. That will help you find the subject. So again, let's take another look at our sentence. Mr. C teaches the class. If we work backwards, we can see that the action here is teaches. So this has to be our verb. And from here, we can say who teaches. The answer, Mr. C. This is how you work backwards to find a subject when you start with the verb. Now that we've established what a verb is and how to recognize it in Latin, we want to look at a particular type of verb known as a linking verb. Linking verbs are ones that link the subject of a sentence to a noun or adjective that describes it. So far, the two linking verbs we've seen are est and sunt. And remember, est means he or she is, while sunt means they are. In English, you want to remember, and in Latin, that linking verbs are always the verb to be. So whenever you see a verb such as est or sunt, and we'll learn the other forms later, that's your red flag that you have a linking verb. Complements are a noun or adjective that describes the subject of a linking verb. So remember, we said a linking verb is linking the subject to a noun or an adjective that describes it. That's what we call the complement. So let's take a look at this sentence. Puella est laita. And if we break it down, we can see that we have a linking verb here, est, and that the subject of this linking verb has to be Puella, the girl. So we mark those with an LV and an S. The only word we have left over here is laita, which is an adjective that means happy. Since happy is an adjective and it's being linked back to our subject Puella, we know that laita has to be a complement, and we mark it with a C. You want to make a quick note of this. A sentence can only contain a complement if it has a linking verb. Without a linking verb, there is no complement in the sentence. One way of thinking about linking verbs is that they're just like an equal sign in math, since the subject and complement are equivalent to each other. So let's take our example sentence. Mr. C is a Latin teacher. If we replace is with an equal sign, it means the exact same thing. Mr. C is equal to a Latin teacher. So in this case, you have the subject of Mr. C and a complement, Latin teacher. They're both equivalent to each other. And just like in math, if we wanted to, we could reverse this and say a Latin teacher is Mr. C. It means the exact same thing in English. Let's put these concepts together by looking at this example. Cornelia est puella Romana. Cornelia is a Roman girl. The first question we want to ask when we're working through Latin sentences is, what's the action being performed? This question will help us find our verb. The answer here is est, or he or she is. This is our verb. It's the action happening. And what we want to figure out is whether or not this is a linking verb. And since the verb is est or sunt, in this case est, we know that this has to be a linking verb. So instead of just a V, we put an LV here to mark it as linking verb. Now we want to find the subject of the sentence. And we do this by asking who or what is performing the action of the sentence. The answer is always going to be your subject. In this case, the subject is Cornelia, so we mark that with an S. Now, since we have a linking verb, we want to immediately look for a complement to see if there's one in the sentence. And the question we ask is there a noun or adjective describing the subject? And in this case, there is. The answer is puella Romana. So the subject Cornelia is being described by puella Romana, Roman girl. This is our complement. We mark it with a C. Now that we've learned some basic about verbs, it's time to look at them more closely. And if we make a list of the verbs we've seen so far in chapters 1 and 2, we notice that they can be split into two categories: verbs ending in the letter T and verbs ending in NT. So on the one hand, we have verbs like est, currit, habitat, sedet, ambulat, legit, and scribet. These all end in a T. On the other hand, we have verbs like sunt, currunt, habitant, sedent, and ambulant. These all end in NT. We can clearly see, looking at these verbs, the pattern. All the verbs on the left are ending in T. All the verbs on the right are ending in NT. But what does all this mean? Well, if we look at the definitions for each verb, we notice that the subject for verbs ending in T is always he, she, or it. As in, he, she, or it is, he, she, or it runs, or he, she, or it lives. On the other hand, if we have our verbs ending in NT, we notice the subject is always translated as they, as in they are, they run, or they live. This leads us to a basic rule about Latin verb endings. And first off, we want to notice that when a verb is singular, or in other words, if the subject of the verb is singular, that verb is going to end in NT. Think back to our sentence, puella in Italia habitat. The T is what tells us this is a singular verb. On the other hand, when the subject of a verb is plural, that verb is going to end in NT. And we want to think, if we said puellae in Italia habitant, we've changed it to a plural. Now it says the girls live in Italy. That habitant, the ending, is telling us that this is a plural verb. This is a big part of Latin, and it's just a snapshot of a much bigger idea. But for now, this basic rule will really help you out. Later on, you're going to see that there's much more to the story than this. So one last note. You might have noticed that in your book, it gives you a few different English definitions for each Latin verb, and each entry is marked as either he or she sits, he or she is sitting, or he or she does sit. These three can be difficult for beginning Latin students to understand, but you want to understand that these three definitions all mean the exact same thing. And in fact, you can do the same thing in English to translate. If you say he sits and he is sitting, the spelling is different, but the meaning is exactly the same. That's what's happening here in Latin. And if you look at the last translation of he does sit, this is one that we often use in questions and answers to questions. So in other words, if you ask the question, does he sit? The answer would be, he does sit. Don't get confused when your textbook switches these translations around. Any Latin verb you come across, these are the three ways you always translate them.